Robinson, what a move! Tim Duncan from three-point line!
You're only half happy, or
Still to be happy about.
you're up 2-0?
Job's not finished.
Brings the crowd to its feet with a big smile. And the Lakers are the 2000 NBA champions.
The 2000s began in the NBA, and it seemed as if the Lakers could win as many titles as they chose to with their dominant duo. Despite that, their count as a franchise for the decade would stop at 4, giving a few other teams a chance to raise Larry O'Brien. Today, we're going through and ranking the 10 title teams from the 2000s, which was somewhat daunting considering 6 of them came from 2 teams. To rank, we'll be using a combination of regular season records, playoff records, finals opponent strength, and roster composition, so admittedly the ranking is somewhat subjective. If you're looking to just flat out statistically rank these squads, you can definitely do so, and the list will probably look a bit different than what's coming here. Before we get started, a friendly reminder to subscribe if you want more content like this, and by the end, if you've liked it, you can show so by hitting the like button. At number 10, the 2006 Miami Heat. Placing award winners in the 10th spot is never fun in these lists, but it's important to remember it's not a slight. They're quite literally being ranked with the best of the best. I mean, sometimes it's a slight, but not here. And although I have somewhat of a nostalgic love for Miami's first title team, at a record of 52-30, 16-7 in the playoffs, and the need for an all-time performance by D-Wade to pull off the reverse sweep, I would give them the 10th spot as a team. Shaquille O'Neal by this point had begun to show his age, looking quite a bit less dominant than his performances just a few years earlier. And on top of that, after he and D-Wade, there was not much shot creation on the roster, forcing Wade to average nearly 35 points a game to take down Dirk's Mavs, who had 0 defensive players capable of slowing him down. Over the years, that's been misconstrued as the series being rigged when, in reality, they just didn't have anybody who could stay in front of him without fouling. But the next closest scorer to Wade in that series? Antoine Walker at 13 points a game. A much older Gary Payton and Alonzo Mourning would also secure their first rings as a part of this title team. Nowitzki's Mavs, while talented, also weren't exactly a powerhouse as Dirk was the only all-star caliber player on the squad. They were still very offensively talented, but Wade found a way to pull this off. Taking a Michael Jordan-like finals performance to win in 6, I'm going to take a lot of teams over the Miami Heat, including, at 9, the 2003 Spurs, or the first title team with Tim, Manu, and Tony all present. This is Ginobili's first run with the team, and he's not quite yet what he will be in just a few short years. David Robinson is in his last season at 37 years old, and it is undoubtedly Timmy's team by this point. With support pieces such as Steven Jackson and Bruce Bowen, this is still easily the least talented Spurs team that wins the championship in the 2000s, and their opponents are a bit questionable. At a regular season record of 60-22, they go 16-8 in the playoffs, advancing to the finals in a series that Dirk Nowitzki misses 3 games of, and then playing the New Jersey Nets, who were one of those weird East teams to make the finals in the early 2000s. Tim Duncan is pure basketball brilliance in this series, and also the MVP of the league that year. But this is definitely not as good as it gets for the Spurs that decade. The 8th spot goes to the Detroit Pistons, and boy was it difficult finding a place for them here. On one hand, they've got one of the most beloved title stories ever, but on the other, that is absolutely because they were one of the least talented squads to win it all, and a pleasant surprise when they did so. To this day, they're still the last team to go all the way without an active superstar player, and they did it with defense, and a well-rounded roster that fit. They would win 54 games in the regular season, then go 16-7 in the playoffs en route to knocking off the Kobe and Shaq Lakers, who tried one of the first super teams built through free agency. Here, it's important to note that Karl Malone was injured during the season and was absolutely a shell of himself by the time the finals came around. Still, that did leave Kobe and Shaq, whose differences led them to fold against a team with far more chemistry and balance. Detroit ranked 2nd in defense and 18th in offensive rating in 2004. That's how difficult and rare this was to do. Still, you will not find a team on this list that had to lean into their defense that heavily, and it'd be hard to take them over any squad that comes next, stylistically or talent-wise. That includes the 2000 Lakers, who get the 7th spot, and like the 03 Spurs, are probably the lesser version of themselves that win later on in the decade. Sure, they've got arguably the most dominant Shaq we'd ever see, but the roster gets thin rather quickly compared to the other Los Angeles teams and still features a rather raw version of Kobe Bryant. On top of that, Kobe gets hurt in the finals, significantly lowering his production and making the team's stat box score look rather lopsided. Also, despite winning 67 regular season games, this team comes dangerously close to being knocked off in the West Finals by an interesting looking Blazers team that, while good, absolutely did not feature a Kobe and Shaq counterpart. In the finals, to cap off their 15-8 run, they play the Pacers, who Shaq absolutely toys with putting up my career numbers. This Lakers team was obviously good, but it was their first time, and I'm taking every later version of themselves this decade. The 2005 Spurs at number 6 were more trio-centric now than 2 years before, with both Tony Parker and Manu playing increased roles. By now, they've also added Robert priori and his knack for hitting big shots. While ranking first in defense that year, they'd win 59 games and more or less breeze through the Western Conference, only losing more than one game in a series there once. It wasn't until they played the defending champions that year in Detroit that they'd be pushed, edging out a tough 7-game series for a 16-7 playoff run. This makes the 05 Spurs the first and only team to defeat a defending champion in the finals on this list. What's even more impressive is that this team won almost 60 games in the season, despite Tim Duncan missing 16 total games, which likely would not have been possible for the 03 team. While San Antonio was proven to be far and away the best team in the league that year, they still wouldn't be the best version of themselves that decade. At the midway point, the 2002 Lakers get the 5th spot on this list. Not only were they more well-rounded than 2000, but also far more mature. That most importantly includes Kobe Bryant, who had more than come into his own by this point, now averaging nearly as many points as Shaq in both the regular season and the playoffs. This was partly due to Shaq missing time that season, giving more of the offensive load to Bryant. By the end, they would finish with 58 wins, but absolutely breeze through the playoffs with a 15-4 record, which is by far the best mark on this list so far. The Kings were the only West team to push them en route to the finals where they'd sweep the Nets. Perhaps the most impressive part, because it definitely wasn't the finals opponent, was that this was their 3rd straight title. This is the very next season after they went 15-1 on their playoff run. Doing it this easily made it feel as though they were just getting started and that there was no end in sight. Still, this is somehow not their best title team or roster that decade. Speaking of roster specifically, at 4, the 2007 Spurs. At 5th in offense and 2nd in defensive rating, with a well-refined version of the Big Three and their support pieces, there was hardly a chance to think they weren't winning it all as the playoffs drug on. After winning 58 regular season games, they'd run through the West, where the Mavs with the MVP would die in the first round, and the Suns would lose Stoudemire to suspension for a game during their series, which was widely regarded as the real NBA Finals that year. As a prize for making it through the West, the Spurs got to play Cleveland, historically heralded as one of the worst finals rosters ever. The Spurs, and specifically Tony Parker, absolutely outclassed them in a sweep where they didn't seem to belong on the same floor. This was the best version of Tony Parker up to that point, and possibly the best of his career. The 07 Spurs could have taken any challenge thrown at them that season, and with their 3rd title of the decade, they'd reached their pinnacle, finishing the playoffs with a 16-4 record. The 2009 Lakers reached new heights here at the 3rd spot with their new duo of Kobe and Gasol. Driven by their heart-wrenching defeat to the 08 Celtics, they were back to prove a point, winning 65 games in the regular season and looking quite immaculate on both sides of the ball. This thanks to their roster composition where 4 players averaged double digits, and the supporting cast was easily the best it had been all decade. The versatility with Lamar Odom, the wing defense between Bryant and Ariza, it was set to be an epic rematch between the Celtics and Lakers. Still, they had a few scares where it looked as if they'd lose to the Rockets in the 2nd round and maybe even be done in by Carmelo's Nuggets. Of course, neither of which happened, setting them up to play the Orlando Magic in the NBA Finals, who were replacing the injured Boston Celtics. An anticlimactic ending to that year, but a title nonetheless, as Bryant would earn his first Finals MVP and title without Shaq. They finished the playoffs with a record of 16-7 and would move on to defend that title against critics who may have said that they'd only won because Boston wasn't there. Speaking of which, the 08 Celtics get the 2 spot nearly by default. This was the first super team of its kind, with 3-star or superstar level players being joined in one offseason while being at or near the top of their games. Not only that, but they came with a supporting cast, which contrasts with teams that get stars but lose all their depth. Defensively and offensively, this team was fantastic. Ray Allen had no problem being the 3rd wheel as a catch-and-shoot player. All 3 of them could provide as much offense as needed, and Kevin Garnett would score Defensive Player of the Year. They'd immediately win 66 games and then shock the world by going 7 in series with teams that did not seem to be in their stratosphere. Still, they'd take care of the bigger threats after them in 6 games, totaling a 16-10 playoff record. Their final opponent, of course, being the Lakers, who paired Kobe and Gasol mid-season. Bynum, who was an important piece to that supporting cast and could have surely helped Gasol against the Celtics' burly front line, did not play due to injury, but the Lakers also fell into a 3-1 hole after blowing Game 4 on their home court. That was a game they led by around 20. A lot has been said about this team over time, but looking at the 2000s, they were really the only legit super team that was in or won the finals that decade. It takes something special to rank over that, and that's exactly what the 2001 Lakers were. After winning 56 games during the regular season, they would famously go 15-1 during the playoffs, and you really just can't argue with that. This was likely the best balance of Kobe and Shaq during their run, as they were nearly 1A and 1B, perfectly terrorizing teams and sweeping their way through the Western Conference. With a diverse supporting cast, it took an all-time performance by Allen Iverson to barely muster up a single game against this squad, otherwise there's a serious chance they may have went undefeated. The Sixers, without their 6th man of the year, of course, were not exactly a juggernaut. Amongst the teams the Lakers swept were the Blazers they'd beaten the year before, Chris Webber's Kings, and the San Antonio Spurs. Maybe, and only maybe, can you argue that there were more overall talented teams than the 01 Lakers, but nothing should be able to take their title as the best champion of the 2000s. They simply erased everything in front of them. However, that is why the YouTube comment section exists, for dissent. So let me know how you would rank these finals teams and why. If you'll notice, dating back to the NBA 2010s video I did like this, the topic was slightly different because there I was talking about which championships were most important, aka like Dirk Nowitzki beating the Big 3 Miami Heat. It was more of that type of ranking, where here I was trying to rank them as teams. So if I get the urge, maybe I could go back and do that for the 2000s. Either way, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to hit the like button, comment, and sub. According to the stats, somehow a lot of the people that watch my videos are not subs, so if you like this type of stuff, you want to see more of it, you gotta sub and hit the bell next to my name for notifications because YouTube decided that was a good idea. I appreciate you all watching, and I'll see you on the next one.